The Perfect Storm by Sebastian Junger. Part 4. Graveyard of the Atlantic. In a few days, the El Dorado expedition went into the patient wilderness that closed upon it, like the sea closes over a diver. Long afterwards, the news came back that all the donkeys were dead. Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. Albert Johnston. I was the first one to know how bad it was really going to be. Halifax called for 20-meter seas, and when we heard that, we thought, oh boy. You don't really have time to run to land, so we tried to get into the coldest water we could find. The colder the water, the denser it is, and the waves didn't get as big. Also, I knew we'd get as northwest wind. I wanted to make as much headway as possible, because the Gulf Stream was down south, and that's where the warm water and fast current are. There was an awful lot of electrical noise along the leading edge of this thing. There was so much noise that you couldn't hear anything on the radio. I was up in the wheelhouse. When it's bad, it's like that. I usually stay up there. If it looks like it's settling down a bit, and I can grab a little sleep, then I will. The crew just racks out and watches videos. Everybody acknowledged that it was the worst storm they'd ever been in. You can tell by the size of the waves, the motion of the boat, the noise, the crashing. There's always a point when you realize that you're in the middle of the ocean, and if anything goes wrong, that's it. You see so much bad weather that you kind of get used to it. But then you see really bad weather, and that you never get used to. They had ship reports of 30-meter seas. That's 90 feet. I would imagine, truthfully, in retrospect, that if the whole U.S. swordfish fleet had been caught in the center of that thing, everybody would have gone down. We only saw, maybe 50-foot waves max. We went into it until it started to get dark, and then we turned around and went with it. You can't see those rogue waves in the dark, and you don't want to get blasted and knock your wheelhouse off. We got the RPM turned in just right to be in sync with the waves. Too fast and we'd start surfing. Too slow and the waves would just blast right over the whole boat. The boat was heavy and looked loaded with fish. Very stable. It made for an amazingly good ride. Johnson had finished his last haul in the afternoon of the 28th. 19 swordfish, 20 big eye, 22 yellowfin, and 2 mako. He immediately started steaming north, and by morning he was approaching the tail of the banks. Winds out of the northeast at 100 knots, and seas 20 to 30 feet, several hundred miles to the west, though conditions have gone off the chart. The Beaufort wind scale defines a force 12 storm as having 73-mile-an-hour winds and 45-foot seas. Due south of Sable Island, data buoy 44-137 starts notching 75-foot waves on the afternoon of the 29th and stays up there for the next 17 hours. Significant wave height. The average of the top a third, also known as H-sig, tops 50 feet. The first 100-foot wave spikes the graph at 8 p.m., and the second one spikes at midnight. For the next 2 hours, peak wave heights stay at 100 feet, and winds hit 80 miles an hour. The waves are blocking the data buoy readings, though, and the wind is probably hitting 120 or so. 80-mile-an-hour wind can suck fish right out of bait barrels. 100-foot waves are 50% higher than the most extreme sizes predicted by computer models. They are the largest waves ever recorded on the Scotian shelf. They are among the very highest waves measured anywhere in the world ever. Scientists understand how waves work, but not exactly how huge ones work. There are rogue waves out there, in other words, that seem to exceed the forces of generating them. For all practical purposes, though, heights of waves are a function of how hard the wind blows, how long it blows for, and how much sea room there is, speed, duration, and fetch. It's also, as it's known, Force 12 winds over Lake Michigan would generate wave heights of 35 feet after 10 hours or so. But the waves couldn't get any bigger than that because the fetch, the amount of open water, isn't great enough. The waves have reached what is called a fully developed sea state. Every wind speed has a minimum fetch and duration to reach a fully developed sea state. Waves driven by a Force 12 wind reach their full potential in 3 or 4 days. A gale blowing across 1,000 miles of ocean for 60 hours would generate significant wave heights of 97 feet. Peak wave heights would be more than twice that. Waves that size have never been recorded, but they must be out there. It is possible that they would destroy anything in a position to measure them. All waves, no matter how huge, start as rough spots cat's paws on the surface of the water. The cat's paws are filled with diamond-shaped ripples, called capillary waves, that are weaker than the surface tension of water, and die out as soon as the wind stops. They give the wind some purchase on an otherwise glassy sea, and at winds over 6 knots, actual waves start to build. The harder the wind blows, the bigger the waves get, and the more wind they are able to catch. It's a feedback loop that has wave height rising exponentially with wind speed. Such waves are augmented by the wind, but not dependent on it. Were the wind to stop, the waves would continue to propagate by endlessly falling into trough that precedes them. Such waves are called gravity waves, or swells. In cross-section, they are symmetrical sine curves that undulate along the surface with almost no energy loss. A cork floating on the surface moves up and down, but not laterally when a swell passes beneath it. The higher the swells, the farther apart the crests, and the faster they move. Antarctic storms have generated swells that are half a mile or more between crests and have 30 or 40 miles an hour. They hit the Hawaiian Islands as breakers 40 feet high. Unfortunately for mariners, the total amount of wave energy in a storm doesn't rise linearly with speed, but to its fourth power. The seas generated by a 40-knot wind aren't twice as violent as those from a 20-knot wind. They're 17 times as violent. A ship's crew watching the anemometer climb even 10 knots could well be watching their death sentence. Moreover, high winds tend to shorten the distance between wave crests and steepen their faces. The waves are no longer symmetrical sine curves. They're sharp peaks that rise far above the sea level, then troughs fall below it. If the height of the wave is more than 1/7 the distance between the crests, the waves become too steep to support themselves and start to break. In shallow water, waves break because the underwater turbulence drags on the bottom and slows the waves down, shortening the wavelength and changing the ratio of height to length. In open ocean, the opposite happens. Wind builds the waves up so fast that the distance between crests can't keep up, and they collapse under their own mass. Now, instead of propagating with near zero energy loss, the breaking wave is suddenly transporting a huge amount of water. It's cashing in its chips, as it were, and converting all its potential and kinetic energy into water displacement. A general rule of fluid dynamics holds that an object in water tends to do whatever the water it replaces would have done. In the case of a boat breaking in a breaking wave, the boat will effectively become part of the curl. It will either be flipped end over end or shoved backward and broken on. Instantaneous pressures of up to 6 tons per square foot have been measured in breaking waves. Breaking waves have lifted a 2,700-ton breakwater en masse and deposited it inside the harbor at Wick, Scotland. They have blasted open a steel door 195 feet above sea level at Unsleit in the Shetland Islands. They have heaved a half-ton boulder 91 feet in the air at Tillamook Rock, Oregon. There is some evidence that average waves are slowly rising, and that freak waves of 80 or 90 feet are becoming more common. Wave heights off the coast of England have risen an average of 25% over the past couple of decades, which converts to a 20-foot increase in the highest waves over the next half-century. One cause may be the tightening of environmental laws, which has reduced the amount of oil flushed into the oceans by oil tankers. Oil spread across water in a film several molecules thick and inhibits the generation of capillary waves, which in turn prevent the wind from getting a grip on the sea. Plankton releases a chemical that has the same effect, and plankton levels in the North Atlantic have dropped dramatically. Another explanation is that the recent warming trend, some call it the greenhouse effect, has made storms more frequent and severe. Waves have destroyed docks and buildings in Newfoundland, for example, that haven't been damaged for decades. As a result, stresses on ships have been rising. The standard practice is to build ships to withstand what is called a 25-year stress, the most violent condition the ship is likely to experience in 25 years. The wave that flooded the wheelhouse of the Queen Mary, 90 feet up, must have nearly exceeded her 25-year stress. North Sea oil platforms are built to accommodate a 3-foot wave behind their decks, which is calculated to be a 100-year stress. Unfortunately, the 25-year stress is just statistical concept that offers no guarantee about what will happen next year or next week. A ship could encounter several 25-year waves in a month or never encounter any at all. Naval architects simply decide what level of stress she's likely to encounter in her lifetime and then hope for the best. It's economically and structurally impractical to construct every boat to 100-year specifications. Inevitably, then, ships encounter the waves that exceed their stress rating. In the dry terminology of naval architecture, these are called non-negotiable waves. Mariners call them rough waves or freak seas. Typically, they are very steep and have an equally steep trough in front of them, a hole in the ocean, as some witnesses have described it. Ships cannot get their bows up fast enough, and the ensuing wave breaks their back. Maritime history is full of encounters with such waves. When Sir Ernest Shackleton was forced to cross the South Polar Sea in a 22-foot open lifeboat, he saw a wave so big that he mistook its foaming crest for a moonlit cloud. He only had time to yell, "Hang on, boys, it's got us," before the wave broke over his boat. Miraculously, they didn't sink. In February 1883, the 320-foot steamship Glamorgan was swept bow to stern by an enormous wave that ripped the wheelhouse right off the deck, taking the ship's officers with it. She later sank. In 1966, the 44,000-ton Michelangelo, an Italian steamship carrying 775 passengers, encountered a single massive wave in an otherwise unremarkable sea. Her bow fell into a trough, and the waves stove in her bow, flooded her wheelhouse, and killed a crewman and 2 passengers. In 1976, the oil tanker Cretan Star radioed vessel was struck by a huge wave that went over the deck and was never heard from again. The only sign of her fate was a 4-mile oil slick off Bombay. South Africa's wild coast between Durban and East London is home to disproportionate number of these monsters. The 4-knot Agulhas current runs along the continental shelf a few miles offshore and plays havoc with swells. Arriving from Antarctic gales, the current shortens their wavelengths, making the swells steeper and more dangerous, and bends them into the fast water the way swells are bent along a beach. Wave energy gets concentrated in the center of the current and overwhelms ships that are there to catch a free ride. In 1973, the 12,000-ton cargo ship Ben Cruchen was cracked by an enormous wave off Durban and had to be towed into port, barely afloat. Several weeks later, the 12,000-ton Neptune Sapphire broke in half on her maiden voyage after encountering a freak sea in the same area. The crew were hoisted off the stern section by helicopter. In 1974, the 132,000-ton Norwegian tanker Wilstar fell into a huge trough. There was no sea in front of the ship, only a hole, said one crew member, and then took an equally huge wave over her bow. The impact crumpled inch-thick steel plate like sheet metal and twisted railroad gauge I-beams into knots. The entire bow bulb was torn off. The biggest rogue on record was during a Pacific gale in 1933, when the 478-foot Navy tanker Ramapo was on her way from Manila to San Diego. She encountered a massive low-pressure system that blew up to 68 knots for a week straight and resulted in a fully developed sea that the Ramapo had no choice but to take on her stern. Unlike today's tankers, the Ramapo's wheelhouse was slightly forward of amidships. Early on the morning of February 7th, the watch officer glanced astern and saw a freak wave rising up behind him that lined up perfectly with a crow's nest above and behind the bridge. Simple geometry later showed the wave to be 112 feet high. Rogue waves such as that are thought to be several ordinary waves that happen to get in step, forming a highly unstable piles of water. Others are waves that overlay long-distance swells from early storms. Such accumulations of energy can travel in threes, a phenomenon called the Three Sisters, and are so huge that they can be tracked by radar. There are cases of Three Sisters crossing the Atlantic Ocean and starting to shoal along the 100-fathom curve off the coast of France. 100 fathoms is 600 feet, which means that freak waves are breaking over the continental shelf as if it were a shoreline sandbar. Most people don't survive encounters with such waves, and so first-hand accounts are hard to come by, but they do exist. An Englishwoman named Beryl Smeaton was rounding Cape Horn with her husband in the 1960s when she saw a shoaling wave behind her that stretched away in a sight line as far as she could see. The whole horizon was blotted out by a huge gray wall, she writes in her journal. It had no curling crest, just a thin white line across the whole length, and its face was unlike the sloping face of a normal wave. This was a wall of water with completely vertical face, down which ran white ripples like a waterfall. The wave flipped the 46-foot boat end over end, snapped Smeaton's harness, and threw her overboard. Tommy Barry had a similar experience off George's Bank. He was laying to in a storm when a wave clobbered him out of nowhere, imploding his windows. There was this boom, and the Lexan windows was blown right off, he says. The window hit the clutch, and so the clutch was pinned, and we couldn't get her into gear. The boat's over a bit, laying in a beam C, and shit flying everywhere, things that had never moved on that boat before going all over the place. The wave ripped the life raft off its mount and blew the front hatch open. It was dogged down, but there was so much water in it. It blew it open anyway. I came up quick and radioed the Miss Millie. Larry, we took a hell of a wave. Stand by, I'm here. I took the boat down sea, and about 10 minutes later, the same wave hit him. His bird came out of the water, and the hull took a big dent. If a wave takes Billy's windows out, it would be similar to the one experienced by Smeaton or Barry, big, steep, and unexpected. It's an awful scene to imagine. Water knee-deep in the wheelhouse, men scrambling up the companionway, wind screaming through the blown-out windows. If enough water gets in, it can make its way down into the engine room, soak the wiring, and take on an electric charge. The entire boat gets electrified. Anyone standing in water gets electrocuted. A boat that loses her windows can start filling up with water in minutes. So 2 men tie safety lines to their waists and crawl out to the whaleback deck with sheets of marine plywood. The plywood acts like a kite. You have to manhandle the son of a bitch, says Charlie Reed. It's a horrible thought. Someone out there in that weather. As captain, it's your worst fear. Someone going over the side. It's hard to find a more dangerous job than venturing into the whaleback during a storm to do a little carpentry. On land, a 100-knot wind reduces people to a crawl. At sea, it knocks you flat. The decks are awash, the boat is rolling, the spray is raking you like grape shot. You work in the calm of the wave troughs and flatten yourself at the crests to keep from being blown off the boat. One man holds the plywood against the window while the other lines up a power drill with the holes in the wheelhouse and starts drilling. He drills one hole, hammers a bolt through, and then someone in the wheelhouse threads on the nut while the men on the outside keep drilling and bolting, until the plywood is screwed down tight. Some captains put a piece of inner tube between the wood and steel to make it waterproof. Although it's a suicidal job, crews that lose their windows almost always manage to get some plywood up, even if it means turning down sea to do it. After the plywood is bolted down, the crew starts bucket bailing the wheelhouse and pulling the cabin back in order. Maybe someone tries to wire the Loran or radio up to a battery to see if he can get a signal. Billy starts shifting fuel from one tank to another, trying to trim the boat. Someone probably checks the engine room and work deck. Are the scuppers clearing their water? Are the birds down? Is the fish hatch secure? There's not much they can do at this point but head into the storm and hope they don't take any more big waves. If waves keep taking out their windows, they could turn around and go down sea. But that generates a whole new set of problems. Several large waves could simply bury them, or the lazarette could flood, or sediment could get stirred up in the tanks and clog the fuel filters. If the ship motion is violent enough, the crew has to change the filters non-stop, pull them out, flush the sediment, put them back in again, over and over as fast as they can, or the engine stops and the boat goes over. There's no question, Billy would radio for help now if he had the capability. All he'd have to do is say Mayday on channel 16 or 2182 kilohertz and give his coordinates. 16 and 2182 are monitored by the Coast Guard, the military, and all ocean-going vessels according to maritime law. Any vessel that picks up a Mayday must respond immediately, unless their own lives would be put in danger. The Coast Guard would send out an Aurora rescue plane to locate the Andrea Gale and circle her. A rescue swimmer and a helicopter crew would be placed on standby at the airbase outside Halifax. The Canadian Coast Guard cutter, Edward Cornwallis, would start steaming east off the out of Halifax on what would probably be a 36-hour trip. The Triumph Sea, an ocean-going tug based at a drilling platform off Sable Island, would put to sea as well. The Conchship Holland, the Zara, and possibly the Mary T. would all try to converge on Billy. Once there, they wouldn't be able to leave until the Coast Guard signs them off. Presumably then, Billy's radios are out. The Coast Guard never receives a call. Now his only link to the rest of the world is his EPIRB, which sits outside in a plastic holster on the whaleback deck. It's about the size of a bowling pin and has a ring switch that can be set to off, on, or armed. EPIRBs are kept permanently in the armed position, and if the boat goes down, a water-sensitive switch triggers a radio signal that gets relayed by satellite to listening posts on shore. The Coast Guard immediately knows the name of the boat, the location, and that something has gone disastrously wrong. If a boat loses her radios before actually sinking, though, the captain can send a distress signal by just twisting the ring switch to the on position. It's the same as screaming Mayday into the radio. Billy doesn't do it, though. He never trips the switch. This can only mean one thing, that he's hopeful about their chances right up until the moment when they have no chance at all. He must figure that the kind of sea that took out their windows probably won't hit again, or that if it does, they'll be able to take it. Statistically, a 40-knot wind generates 30 or 40-foot breaking sea every 6 minutes or so. Green water over the bow and white water over the house. Every hour, perhaps, Billy might get hit by a breaking 50-footer. That's probably the kind of wave that blew out the windows, and every 100 hours, Billy can expect to run into a non-negotiable wave, a breaking 70-footer, that could flip the boat end over end. He's got to figure the storm's going to blow out before his 100 hours are up. Everyone on a sinking boat reacts differently. A man on one Gloucester boat just curled up and started to cry while his shipmates worked untethered on deck. The Andrea Gale crew, all experienced fishermen, are probably trying to shrug it off as just another storm. They've been through this before. They'll go through it again. And at least they're not puking. Billy's undoubtedly working too hard at the helm to give drowning much thought. Ernie Hazard claims it was just the last thing on his mind. There was no conversation, just real businesslike. He says, off of going down on George's Bank, "You know, let's just get this thing done. Never any overwhelming sense of danger. We were just very, very busy." Be that as it may, certain realities still must come crashing in. At some point, Tyne, Shatford, Sullivan, Moran, Murphy, and Pierre must realize there's no way off this boat. They could trigger the EPIRB, but a night rescue in these conditions would be virtually impossible. They could deploy the life raft, but they probably wouldn't survive the huge seas. If the boat goes down, they go down with it, and no one on Earth can do anything about it. Their lives are utterly and completely in their own hands. The fact must settle into Bobby Shatford's stomach like a bad meal. It was he, after all, who had those terrible misgivings the day they left. The last afternoon on the dock, he came within a hair's breadth of saying no, just telling Chris to start up the car and drive. They could have gone back to her place, or up the coast, or anywhere at all. It wouldn't have mattered. He wouldn't be in this storm right now, and neither would the rest of them. It would have taken Billy at least a day to replace them, and right now they'd still be east with the rest of the fleet. The previous spring, Bobby and Chris rented a movie called The Fighting Sullivans, about 5 brothers who died on a U.S. Navy boat during World War II. It was Ethel's favorite movie. Sitting there with Chris watching the movie and thinking about his brothers, Bobby started to cry. He was not a man who cried easily, and Chris was unsure what to do. Should she say something? Pretend not to notice? Turn off the TV? Finally, Bobby said that he was upset by the idea of all of his brothers fishing, and that if anything happened to him, he wanted to be buried at sea. Chris said that nothing was going to happen to him, but he insisted. Just bury me at sea, he said. Promise me that. And now here he is, getting buried at sea. The conditions have degenerated from bad to unspeakable. Beaufort Force 10 or 11. The British Manual of Seamanship describes a Force 10 gale as foam is in great patches and is blown in dense white streaks along the direction of the wind. The rolling of the sea becomes heavy and shock-like. Force 11 is even worse. Exceptionally high waves. Small or medium-sized ships might be lost from view behind them. The sea is completely covered with long patches of white foam. Hurricane Grace, still working her way north, and when she collides with the Sable inland storm, probably in a day or so, conditions will get even more severe. Maybe as high as Force 12. Very few boats that size can withstand a Force 12 gale. Since Billy presumably can't use his radio, there's no way to know how things are going aboard the Andrea Gale. A fairly good idea, though, can be had from the Ancient Maru 78, the Japanese longliner 200 miles to the southwest. The Ancient Maru has a Canadian observer on board, Judith Reves, who is charged with making sure that the vessel abides by Canadian fishing regulations. The storm hits the Ancient Maru around the same time as the Andrea Gale, but not as abruptly. Buoy 44-137, 60 miles to the south, shows a slow, gradual increase in wind speed, starting at 5 p.m. on the 28th. By dawn on the 29th, the wind is 40 knots, gusting to 50, and peak wave heights are only at 45 feet. That's considerably less than what Billy is experiencing, but it just keeps getting worse. By midnight, sustained wind speeds are 50 knots, gusts are hitting 60, and peak wave heights are over 100 feet. At 10 past 8 at night, October 29th, the first big wave hits the Ancient Maru. It blows out a port side window with the sound of a shotgun going off. Water inundates the bridge and barrels down the hallway into Reva's room. She hears panicked shouts from the crew, and then orders that she doesn't understand. Men scramble to board up the window and bail out the water, and within an hour, the captain has regained control of the bridge. The boat is taking horrific beating, though. She's 150 feet long, twice the size of the Andrea Gale, and waves are completely burying her decks. There are no life jackets on hand, no survival suits, and no EPIRB. Just before dawn, the second wave hits. It blows out 4 windows at this time, including one with plywood over it. All the circuits went. There was smoke and wires crackling, says Revis. We crippled the ship, the VHF, the radar, the internal communication system, the navigation monitors. They were all rendered inoperable. That's when the radio operator came to me and said, in signal language, that he wanted me to go into the radio room. The radio operator had managed to contact the ship's agent by satellite phone, and Revis is put on the line to explain what kind of damage they've sustained. While she's talking, Coast Guard New York breaks in. They've been listening on the conversation and want to know if the Ancient Maru needs help. Revis says they've lost most of their electronics and are in serious trouble. New York patches her through to the Coast Guard in Halifax. And while they're discussing how to get people off the boat, the radio operator interrupts her. He's pointing to a sentence in an English phrase book. Revis leans in close to read it. We are helpless and drifting. Please render all assistance. Unknown to Revis, the steering linkage has just failed, although the radio operator doesn't know how to explain that to her. It's at this moment that Revis realizes she's going down at sea. We had no steerage, and we were right in the eye of the storm, she says. It was a confused sea. All the waves were coming from different directions. The wind was picking up the tops of the waves and slinging them so far that when the search and rescue plane arrived, we couldn't even see it. The whole vessel would get shoved over on its side, so that we were completely upside down. If you get hit by one wave and then hit by another, you can drive the vessel completely down into the water. And so that second before the vessel starts to come up, you're just holding your breath, waiting. They're dead in the water, taking the huge waves broadside. According to Revis, they are doing 360-degree barrel rolls and coming back up. 4 boats try to respond to her mayday, but 3 of them have to stand down because of the weather. They cannot continue without risking their own lives. The ocean-going tug Triumph C leaves Sable Island and claws her way southward, and the Coast Guard cutter Edward Cornwallis is on her from way from Halifax. The crew of the Ancient Maru, impassive, are sure that they're going to die. Rivas is too busy to think about it. She has to look for the life jackets, work the radio and satellite phone, flip through the Japanese phrase book. Eventually, she has a moment to consider her options. Either I jump ship or I go down with the ship. As for her first possibility, I thought about it for a while until I realized that they'd hammered all the hatches down. I thought, God, I'll never get off this friggin' boat. It will be my tomb. So I figured I'd do whatever I had to do all at the time, and there was no point in really thinking about it because it was just too frightening. I was just gripped by this feeling that I was going to have to do something very unpleasant. You know, like drowning is not going to be pleasant, and it wasn't until the moment we lost the steerage that I actually thought we were going to die. I mean, I knew there was a real possibility, and I was going to have to face that. Soon after losing steerage, a communications officer in New York asked Revis how it's going. Not too well, she says. Is your survival suit out? Yeah, it's here, she says. Well, how many Japanese can you fit into it? Revis laughs. Even that slight joke is enough to ease the desperateness of the situation. A couple of hours later, the satellite phone rings. Probably it's Canadian radio reporter who wants to interview her. His name is Ricky Howe. Miss Revis, is it rough out there? Howe asks over the static and wind shriek. It's pretty rough. What about the trawler? What's the problem? It's not a trawler. It's a longliner. The problem is we took the 3 windows out of the bridge earlier this morning and lost all our instrumentation. Are you in any danger, or are you confident everything's going to work out all right? Well, we're in danger. Definitely we're in danger. We're drifting in 12-meter swells and between 50 and 60 knot winds. If I get any more water coming through the bridge, that's going to wipe out any communication that we have left. So we're definitely in danger now. Do you know how close the nearest ship to you is? We're looking at about 100 miles. If we have to abandon ship, there are helicopters that can be here in 3.5 hours. Unfortunately, they won't be able to come in the dark, so if anything happens in the dark, we're goners. You mentioned that you expect the weather to clear up later in the day. What more can you tell us about that? The swell size is supposed to go down to 5 to 8 meters, and the winds come around to the east 25 to 35 knots. So that will take a lot of the edge off and the fear I have right now, which is of sustaining a direct hit. If we take a direct hit and the boat goes over, and we take another hit, the boat goes down. And we're all shored up here. Everything is battened down, hatched, and practically nailed shut. If she goes over, there's no way anybody's gonna get out over. Now, is there any point where you may have to abandon ship? And is the crew and yourself prepared for that eventuality? Well, to tell you the absolute truth, I don't think the crew is very prepared for an emergency. They have no emergency beacon and don't seem very up on their emergency procedure, which is a little frightening. I'm the only one who has a survival suit, but in a swell like we have today, it wouldn't do me much good. Yeah, right. Well, listen, I thank you for talking to us, and the whole of the province is praying for your safe return. Thank you. With that, Reeves turns back to the business at hand. After talking to Tommy Barry, Billy is probably able to steam northwest another 2 or 3 hours before the seas get too rough to take on his stern. That would place him just north of Data Buoy 44139, on the edge of Banqueteau, one of the old fishing grounds off Nova Scotia. The 200-fathom line turns a corner at Banquereau, running north up the St. Lawrence Channel and south-southwest to Sable Island. About 60 miles due east is an underwater canyon called the Gully, and then the Sable Island shallows start. Sable Island is a 20-mile sandbar that extends another 40 or 50 miles east-west below the water. From a distance, the surf that breaks on the shoals looks like a white sand cliff. Mariners have headed for it in storms, thinking they might save themselves by driving their boat onto the beach, only to be pounded to pieces by 20-foot waves on the outer bar. Sable Island historian George Patterson writes, in 1894, from the east end, the bar stretches northeasterly for 17 miles, of which the first 4 are dry in fine weather, the next 9 covered with heavy breakers, and the last 4 with a heavy cross sea. The island and its bar presents a continuous line of upwards of 50 miles of terrific breakers. The currents around the island are terribly conflicting and uncertain, sometimes passing around the whole circuit of the compass in 24 hours. An empty cask will be carried around and round the island, making the circuit several times, and the same is the case with bodies from wrecks. The island prowls restlessly around the Scotian shelf, losing sand from one end, building it up on the other, endlessly throughout the centuries. Since 1873, it has melted away beneath the foundations of 6 lighthouses. Herds of wild horses live on the island, descendants of tough Breton mountain horses left there by the French. Nothing but the marron grass holds the dunes in place, and cranberries, blueberries, and wild roses grow in the England bogs. The Gulf Stream and the glacial Labrador current converge at Sable, frequently smothering the island in the fog. 5,000 men are said to have drowned in its shallows, earning it the name the Graveyard of the Atlantic, and at least that many have been pulled to safety by life-saving crews that have been maintained there since 1801. We have had a tolerable winter, and no wrecks except the hull of the schooner Juno of Plymouth, one island keeper recorded in 1820. She came ashore without masts, sails, or rigging of any description, and no person on board except one dead man in the hold. In bad weather, horsemen circled the island looking for ships in distress. If any were spotted, the horsemen rushed back for the surf boat and rowed out through the breakers to save anyone who was still alive. Sometimes they were able to fire rockets with a line attached and rig up a breeches buoy. After the storm died down, they'd salvage the cargo and saw the ship timber up for firewood or construction material. People pulled from sinking ships often spent the entire winter on the island. Sometimes 200 or 300 people would be camped out in the dunes, waiting for a relief ship to arrive in the spring. Today, there are 2 lighthouses, a Coast Guard station, a meteorological station, and several dozen oil and natural gas wells. There's a 60-foot shoal 30 miles to the northwest and a 45-foot shoal 20 miles to the east. They mark the western and eastern ends of the sandbar, respectively. Billy isn't right on top of the bars yet, but he's getting close. In the old days, it was known that most shipwrecks on Sable occurred because of errors in navigation. The westerly current was so strong that it could throw boats off by 60 to 100 miles. If Billy has lost his electronics, his GPS radar, and LORAN, he's effectively back in the old days. He'd have a chart of the Grand Banks on the chart table and would be estimating his position based on compass heading, forward speed, and wind conditions. This is called reckoning. Maybe the currents and the storm winds push Billy farther west than he realizes, and he gets into the shallows around Sable. Maybe he has turned down sea, or on purpose, to keep water out of the wheelhouse, or to save fuel. Or maybe their steering's gone, and like the Ancient Maru, they're careening westward on the weather. Whether it is, one thing is known for sure. Around midnight on October 28th, when the storm is at its height off Sable Island, something catastrophic happens aboard the Andrea Gale. The 0 moment point. Behold, a pale horse, and his name who sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. Revelation 6:8. In the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. government decided to detonate a series of nuclear devices in the Pacific Ocean. The thinking was that deep water would absorb the shock wave and minimize the effect on the environment, while still allowing scientists to gauge the strength of the explosions. But an oceanographer named William Van Dorn, associated with the Scripps Institute in La Jolla, California, warned them that a nuclear explosion in the wrong place can convert the entire continental shelf into a surf zone. Concerned, the Navy ran a series of wave tank tests to see what kind of stresses their fleet could take. They already lost 3 destroyers to a typhoon in 1944. Before going down, the ships had radioed that they were rolling through arcs of 140 degrees. They downflooded through their stacks and sank. The Navy subjected model destroyed destroyers and aircraft carriers to various kinds of waves and found that a single non-breaking wave, no matter how big it was incapable of sinking a ship. A single breaking wave, though, would flip a ship end over end if it was higher than the ship was long. Typically, the ship would climb the wave at an angle of 45 degrees, fail to gain the top, and then slide back down the face. Her stern would bury itself into the trough, and the crest of the wave would catch her bow and flip her over. This is called pitch poling. Ernie Hazard was pitch poled on Georges Bank. It's one of the few motions that can end ship-to-shore communication instantly. Another is succession of waves that simply drives the boat under founders, as mariners say. The dictionary defines founder as to cave in, sink, fail, utterly collapse. On a steel boat, the windows implode, the hatches fail, and the boat starts to downflood. The crew is prevented from escaping by the sheer force of the water pouring into the cabin. It's like walking into the blast of a fire hose. In that sense, pitch poling is better than foundering because an overturned boat traps air in the hold and can stay afloat for an hour or more. That might allow members of the crew to swim out a doorway and climb into a raft. The rafts are designed to inflate automatically and release from the boat when she goes down. In theory, the EPIRB floats free as well and begins signaling to shore. All the crew has to do is stay alive. By the late hours of October 28th, the sea state is easily high enough to either pitch pole the Andrea Gale or drive her under. And if she loses power, a clogged fuel filter, a fouled prop, she could slew to the side and roll. The same rule applies to capsizing as to pitch poling. The wave must be higher than the boat is wide. The Andrea Gale is 20 feet across her beam, but even if the boat doesn't get hit by a non-negotiable wave, the rising sea state allows Billy less and less leeway to maneuver. If he maintains enough speed to steer, he beats the boat to pieces. If he slows down, he loses rudder control. This is the end result of 2 days of narrowing options. Now the only choice left is whether to go up-sea or down, and the only outcome is whether they sink or float. There's not much in between. If the conditions don't subside, the most Billy can realistically hope for is to survive until dawn. Then at least they'll have a chance of being rescued. Now it's unthinkable. In violent storms, there is so much water in the air and so much air in the water that it becomes impossible to tell where the atmosphere stops and the sea begins, writes Van Dorn. That may typically make it impossible to distinguish up from down. In such conditions, a helicopter pilot could never pluck 6 people off the deck of a boat. So for the next 8 hours, the crew of the Andrea Gale must keep the pumps and engine running and just hope they don't encounter any rogue waves. 70-footers are roaming around the sea state like surly giants, and there's not much Billy can do but take them head on and try to get over the top before they break. If his floodlights are out, he wouldn't even have that option. He'd just feel a drop into the trough, a lurch, and the boat starting up a slope way too steep to survive. 70-foot seas. I'd be putting on my diapers at that point, says Charlie Reed. I'd be quite nervous. That's higher than the highest point on the Andrea Gale. I once came home from the Grand Banks in 35-foot seas. It was scary. It was a scary fucking thought. Straight up, straight down for 6 days. My guess is that Billy turned side to and rolled. You come off one of those seas cocked. The next one comes at a different angle. It pushes the boat around, and then you roll. If the boat flips over, even with everything dogged down, water's gonna get in. The boat's upside down. The plywood's buckling. That's the end. When Ernie Hazard went over on George's Bank in 1982, the motion wasn't a violent one as much as a huge, slow somersault that laid the boat over on her back. Hazard remembers one wave spinning them around and another lifting them end over end. It wasn't like rolling a car at high speeds. It was more like rolling a house. Hazard was 33 at the time. 3 years earlier, he had answered a newspaper ad and got a job on the Fairwind, a lobster boat out of Newport, Rhode Island. The storm hit on their last trip of the year, late November. The crew were all good friends. They celebrated the end of their season at a steakhouse and then left for George's Bank in the late the next morning. The winds were light, and the forecast called for several more days of fair weather. By dawn, it was blowing 100. We were driving the boat. You point the boat into the sea and try to hold on until it blows out. Stay there. Take your pounding. You balance the boat. Flood the tanks. Try to save what you have on deck. There was the typical howling of the wind in the wires, and there was a lot of foam because of the wind. Yellow foam, spindrift. We'd lose power on the waves because there were more foam than water. The propeller just couldn't bite. It happened quick. We were close to the edge of the continental shelf, and the seas were getting large. It started to break, cresting. I remember looking out the pilot house, and this monster wave came and broke over the bow and forced us backwards. There was nothing to hold us there, and we must have dug the stern in and then spun around. Now we're in a full following sea. We never went more wave than when we buried our bow in the trough and flipped over. There was a wave breaking, and then a sensation of the boat turning. And the next thing I knew, we were upside down, floating inside the boat. I happened to surface in a small air pocket, and I didn't know if I was upside down or standing on the walls or what. I made a dive into the pilot house, and I could see some light, and it could have been a window or a porthole. I don't know. And when I got back up into the wheelhouse, there was no more air. It was all gone. I was thinking, this is it. Just take a mouthful of water and it's over. It was very matter of fact. I was at a fork in the road, and there was work to do, swim or die. It didn't scare me. I didn't think about my family or anything. It was more businesslike. People think you always have to go for life, but you don't. You can quit. For reasons that he still doesn't understand, Hazard didn't quit. He made a guess and swam. The entire port side of the cabin was welded steel, and he knew if he picked that direction, he was finished. He felt himself slide through a narrow opening, the door, a window, and suddenly he was back in the world. The boat was hull up, sliding away fast, and the life raft was convulsing at the end of its tether. It was his only hope. He wriggled out of his clothes and started to swim. Whether the Andrea Gale rolls, pitch poles, or gets driven down, she winds up, one way or another, in a position from which she cannot recover. Among marine architects, this is known as the zero-moment point, the point of no return. The transition from crisis to catastrophe is fast, probably under a minute, or someone would have tripped the EPIRB. In fact, the EPIRB doesn't even signal when it hits the water, which means it has somehow malfunctioned. In the vast majority of cases, the Coast Guard knows when men are dying offshore. There's no time to put on survival suits or grab a life vest. The boat's moving through the most extreme motion of her life, and there isn't even time to shout. The refrigerator comes out of the wall and crashes across the galley. Dirty dishes cascade out of the sink. The TV, the washing machine, the VCR tapes, the men all go flying, and seconds later, the water moves in. When a boat floods, the first thing that happens is her electrical system shorts. The lights go off, and for a few moments, the only illumination is the frenetic blue of sparks arcing down into the water. It's said that people in extreme situations perceive things in distorted, almost surreal ways, and when the wires start to crackle and burn, perhaps one of the crew thinks of fireworks, or the last 4th of July, walking around Gloucester with his girlfriend, and watching colors blossom over the inner harbor. There'd be tourists shuffling down Rogers Street, and fishermen hooting from bars, and the smell of gunpowder and fried clams drifting through town. He'd have his whole life ahead of him. That July evening, he'd have every choice in the world. And he wound up sword fishing. He wound up, by one route or another, on this trip. In this storm, with this boat filling up with water, and 1 or 2 minutes left to live. There's no going back now, no rescue helicopter that could possibly save him. All that's left is to hope it's over fast. When the water first hits the trapped men, it's cold, but not paralyzing, around 52 degrees. A man can survive up to 4 hours in that temperature if something holds him up. If the boat rolls or flips over, the men in the wheelhouse are the first to drown. Their experience is exactly like Hazard's, except that they don't make it out of the wheelhouse to a life raft. They inhale, and that's it. After that, the water rises up the companionway, flooding the galley and berths, and then it starts up the inverted engine room hatch. It may well be pouring in the aft door and the fish hatch too. If either failed during the sinking, if the boat hulls up and there are men in the engine room, they are the last to die. They're in absolute darkness, under a landslide of tools and gear, the water rising up the companionway, and the roar of the waves probably very muted through the hull. If the water takes long enough, they might attempt to escape on a lungful of air, down the companionway, along the hull, through the aft door, and out from under the boat. But they don't make it. It's too far. They die trying. Or the water comes up so hard and fast they can't even think. They're up to their waists, and then their chests, and then their chins, and when there's no air at all, just what's in their lungs. A minute's worth or so. The instinct not to breathe underwater is so strong that it overcomes the agony of running out of air. No matter how desperate the drowning person is, he doesn't inhale until he's on the verge of losing consciousness. At that point, there's so much carbon dioxide in the blood and so little oxygen that chemical sensors in the brain trigger an involuntary breath, whether he's underwater or not. That's called the breakpoint. Laboratory experiments have shown the breakpoint to come after 87 seconds. It's a sort of neurological optimism, as if the body were saying, holding our breath is killing us, and breathing in might not kill us, so we might as well breathe in. If the person hyperventilates first, as freedivers do, and as a frantic person might, the breakpoint comes as late as 140 seconds. Hyperventilation initially flushes carbon dioxide out of the system, so it takes that much longer to climb back up to critical levels. Under the breakpoint, a drowning person is said to be undergoing voluntary apnea, choosing not to breathe. Lack of oxygen to the brain causes a sensation of darkness closing in from all sides, as in a camera aperture stopping down. The panic of a drowning person is mixed with an odd incredulity that is actually happening. Having never done it before, the body and the mind do not know how to die gracefully. The process is filled with desperation and awkwardness. So this is drowning. A drowning person might think, so this is how my life finally ends. Along with the disbelief is an overwhelming sense of being wrenched from life at the most banal, inopportune moment imaginable. I can't die. I have tickets to next week's game. Is not an impossible thought for someone who is drowning. The drowning person may even feel embarrassed, as if he squandered a great fortune. He has an image of people shaking their heads over his dying so senselessly. The drowning person may feel as if it's the last great act of stupidity in his life. These thoughts shriek through the mind during the minute or so that it takes a panicked person to run out of air. When the first involuntary breath occurs, most people are still conscious, which is unfortunate, because the only thing more unpleasant than running out of air is breathing in water. At that point, the person goes from voluntary to involuntary apnea, and the drowning begins in earnest. A spasmodic breath drags water into the mouth and windpipe, and then one of two things happen. In about 10% of people, water, anything touching the vocal cords, triggers an immediate contraction of the muscles around the larynx. In effect, the central nervous system judges something in the voice box to be more of a threat than low oxygen levels in the blood, and acts accordingly. This is called a laryngospasm. It's so powerful that it overcomes the breathing reflex and eventually suffocates the person. A person with a laryngospasm drowns without any water in his lungs. In the other 90% of people, water floods the lungs and ends any waning transfer of oxygen to the blood. The clock is running down now. Half conscious, half enfeebled by oxygen depletion, the person is in no position to fight his way back up to the surface. The very process of drowning makes it harder and harder not to drown, an exponential disaster curve similar to that of a sinking boat. Occasionally, someone makes it back from this dark world, though, and it's from these people that we know what drowning feels like. In 1892, a Scottish doctor named James Lawson was on a steamship bound for Colorado, Sri Lanka, when they ran into a typhoon and went down in the dead of night. Most of the 150 people on board sank with the ship, but Lawson managed to fight his way out of the hold and over the side. The ship sank out from under his feet, dragging him down, and the last thing he remembers is losing consciousness underwater. A few minutes later, the buoyancy of his life vest shot him to the surface, though, and he washed up on an island and lived to write about his experiences in the Edinburgh Medical Journal. He attributed the clarity of his recollection to the preternatural calm of people facing death. It's as close as one is going to get to the last moments of the Andrea gale. All afternoon, the hammering of the big seas on the doomed vessel went on, whilst night came only to add darkness to our other horrors. Shortly before 10 o'clock, 3 tremendous seas found their way down the stokehole, putting the fires, and our situation was desperate. The end came shortly before midnight, when there was a heavy crash on the reef, and the vessel was lying at the bottom of the Straits of Formosa in under a minute. With scarcely time to think, I pulled down the life belts and, throwing 2 to my companions, tied the 3rd on myself and bolted for the companionway. There was no time to spare for studying humanity at this juncture, but I can never forget the apparent want of initiative in all I passed. All the passengers seemed paralyzed, even my companions, some of them able military men, the stewards of the ship, uttering cries of despair and last farewells, blocked the entrance to the deck, and it was only by sheer force I was able to squeeze past them. Getting out on deck, a perfect mountain of water seemed to come from overhead as well as from below, and dashed me against the bridge companionway. The ship was going down rapidly, and I was pulled down with her, struggling to extricate myself. I got clear under water and immediately struck out to reach the surface, only to go farther down. This exertion was serious waste of breath, and after 10 or 15 seconds, the effort of inspiration could no longer be restrained. It seemed as if I was in a vice, which was gradually being screwed up tight until it felt as if the sternum and spinal column must break. Many years ago, my old teacher used to describe how painless and easy death by drowning was, like falling about in a green field in early summer, and this flashed across my brain at the time. The gulping efforts became less frequent, and the pressure seemed unbearable, but gradually the pain seemed to ease up. I appeared to be in a pleasant dream, although I had enough willpower to think of friends at home and the sight of the Grampians familiar to me as a boy. That was brought into my view. Before losing consciousness, the chest pain had completely disappeared, and the sensation was actually pleasant. When consciousness returned, I found myself at the surface, and managed to get a dozen good inspirations. Land was about 400 yards distant, and I used a bale of silk, and then a long wooden plank to assist me to shore. On landing and getting behind a sheltering rock, no effort was required to produce copious emesis. After the excitement, sound sleep set in, and this sleep lasted 3 hours, when a profuse diarrhea came on, evidently brought on by the seawater ingested. Until morning broke, all my muscles were a constant tremor, which could not be controlled. Several weeks later, I was sleeping in a comfortable bed, and late in the evening, a nightmare led to me having a severe struggle with the bedroom furniture, finally taking a header out of the bed and coming to grief on the floor. Lawson guesses that laryngospasm prevented water from entering his lungs when he was unconscious. The crew of the Andrea Gale either have laryngospasms or completely inundated lungs. They are suspended, open-eyed and unconscious, in the flooded enclosure of the boat. The darkness is absolute, and the boat may already be on her way to the bottom. At this point, only a massive amount of oxygen could save these men. They have suffered at most a minute or two. Their bodies have imposed increasingly drastic measures to keep functioning, have finally started to shut down. Water in the lungs washes away a substance called surfactant, which enables the alveoli to leach oxygen out of the air. The alveoli themselves, grape-like clusters of membrane on the lung walls, collapse because blood cannot get through the pulmonary artery. The artery has constricted in an effort to shunt blood to areas of the lungs where there is more oxygen. Unfortunately, those don't exist. The heart labors under critically low levels of oxygen and starts to beat erratically, like a bag full of worms, as one doctor says. This is called ventricular fibrillation. The more irregularly the heart beats, the less blood it moves, and the faster life functions decline. Children who have proportionally stronger hearts than adults can maintain a heartbeat for up to 5 minutes without air. Adults die faster. The heart beats less and less effectively until, after several minutes, There's no movement at all. Only the brain is alive. The central nervous system does not know what has happened to the body. All it knows is that not enough oxygen is getting to the brain. Orders are still being issued. Breathe, pump, circulate. The body cannot obey. If the person were defibrillated at that moment, he might possibly survive. He could be given cardiopulmonary resuscitation, put on a respirator, and coaxed back to life. Still, the body is doing everything it can to delay the inevitable. When the cold water touches the face, an impulse travels along the trigeminal nerve to the central nervous system and lowers the metabolic rate. The pulse slows down and the blood pools where it's needed most, in the heart and skull. It's a sort of temporary hibernation that drastically reduces the body's need for oxygen. Nurses will splash ice water in the face of a person with a racing heart to trigger the same reaction. The diving reflex, as this is called, is compounded by the general effect of cold temperature on tissue. It preserves it. All chemical reactions and metabolic processes become honey slow, and the brain can get by on less than half the oxygen it normally requires. There are cases of people spending 40 or 45 minutes or 50 minutes under lake ice and surviving. The colder the water, the stronger the diving reflex, the slower the metabolic process, and the longer the survival time. The crew of the Andrea Gale do not find themselves in particularly cold water, though. It may add 5 or 10 minutes to their lives, and there is no one around to save them anyway. The electrical activity in their brain gets weaker and weaker until after 15 or 20 minutes, it ceases altogether. The body could be likened to a crew that resorts to increasingly desperate measures to keep their vessel afloat. Eventually, the last wire has shorted out. The last bit of decking has settled under the water. Tyne, Pierre, Sullivan, Moran, Murphy, and Shatford are dead. The world of the living. The sea had kept his finite body up, but drowned the infinite of his soul. He saw God's foot upon the treadle of the loom, and spoke it, and his shipmates called him mad. Herman Melville, Moby Dick. Albert Johnston, 50 miles south of the tail on the Mary T, gets hit a few hours after the Andrea Gale, but just as hard. The first sign of the storm is a massive amount of static over the VHF, and then the wind comes, 30, 40, 50 knots, and finally it tears the anemometer off buoy 44-138. The buoy is about 50 miles northwest of Johnston's position, and pegs 56 knots before flatlining at the bottom of the chart. Wind speeds above the interference of the wave crests are probably half again as high. The center of the low slides past Johnston late on the 28th and continues curving back around toward the coast throughout the next day. That motion spares Johnston the worst of the storm. It also, as far as he's concerned, spares him his life. Johnston jogs into the wind and seas until night falls and then turns around and goes with it. He doesn't want to take the chance of running into a rogue wave in the dark and blowing his windows out. Throughout the early hours of October 29th, he surfs downwind on the backs of the huge seas, following a finger of cold Labrador current, and when dawn breaks, he turns around and fights his way northward again. He wants to gain enough sea room so that he won't hit the Gulf Stream when he runs south again the following night. On the second day, the crew fight their way onto the deck to check the fish hold and lazarette hatches and tighten the anchor fastenings. The sun has come out, glancing dully off the green ocean, and the wind screams out of the east, setting the cables to moaning and sending long streaks of foam scuttling through the air. Radio waves become so bogged down in the saturated air that the radar stops working. At one point, an unidentified Japanese sword boat appears out of nowhere, searchlight prying into the gloom, and passes within a few hundred yards of the Mary T. On the steeper seas, she can't get her bow up in time and plunges straight through the wall of water. Nothing but her wheelhouse shows, and then slowly, unstoppably, her bow rises back up. The two vessels pass by each other without a word or sign, unable to communicate, unable to help each other, navigating their own courses through hell. Except for that one expedition on deck to check the fish hold, the crew keep to their bunks, and Johnston stays bolted to the wheelhouse floor. Wrestling the helm and jotting down notes in the ship log, his entries are terse bullet descriptions of unsending chaos outside. Northeast, 80 to 100 winds came on as we passed through the west side of I. He records on the 29th. Seas 20 to 30 feet. Dangerous storm to move east. 15 knots. Become station drift southwest and merge with Grace. Johnson is one of the most meteorologically inclined captains of the Sword Fleet, and he's been keeping a weather eye on Hurricane Grace, which has been quietly slipping up the coast. At 8 a.m. on the 29th, Grace collides with the cold front, as predicted, and goes reeling back out to sea. She's moving extremely fast, packing 80-knot winds and 30-foot seas. She's a player now, an important, if dying, element in the atmospheric machinery assembling itself on the south of Sable. Grace crosses the 40th parallel that afternoon, and at 8 p.m. on October 29th, Hurricane Grace runs into the Sable Island storm. The effect is instantaneous. Tropical air is a sort of meteorological accelerant that can blow another storm system through the roof. And within hours of encountering Hurricane Grace, the pressure gradient around the storm forms the equivalent of a cliff. Weather charts plot barometric pressure the way topographical maps plot elevation, and in both cases, the closer together the lines are, the steeper the change. Weather charts of the Grand Banks for the early hours of October 30th show isobaric lines converging in one black mass on the north side of the storm. A storm with tightly packed isobaric lines is said to have a steep pressure gradient, and the wind will rush downhill, as it were, with a particular violence. In the case of the storm off Sable Island, the wind starts rushing into the low at speeds up to 100 miles an hour. As a NOAA disaster report put it blandly a year later, the dangerous storm previously forecast was now fact. The only good thing about such winter gales, as far as coastal residents are concerned, is that they tend to travel west to east offshore. That means their forward movement is subtracted from their wind speed. A 70-knot wind from a storm moving away at 20 knots effectively becomes a 50-knot wind. The opposite is also true, for forward movement is added to wind speed, but that almost never happens on the East Coast. The atmospheric movement is all west to east in the mid-latitudes, and it's nearly impossible for a weather system to overcome that. Storms may wobble northeast or southeast for a while, but they never really buck the jet stream. It takes a freakish alignment of variables to permit that to happen. A third cog in the huge machinations of the sky. Generally speaking, it takes a hurricane. By October 30th, the Sable Island storm is firmly embedded between the remnants of Hurricane Grace and the Canadian High. Like all large bodies, hurricanes have a hard time slowing down, and her counterclockwise circulation continues long after her internal structures have fallen apart. The Canadian High, in the meantime, is still spinning clockwise with dense, cold air. These two systems function like huge gears that catch the storm between their teeth and extrude it westward. This is called retrograde. It's an act of meteorological defiance that might happen in a major storm only every 100 years or so. As early as October 27th, NOAA's Cray computers in Maryland were saying that the storm would retrograde back toward the coast. 2 days later, Bob Case was in his office watching exactly that happen on GOES satellite imagery. Meteorologists see perfection in strange things, and the meshing of three completely independent weather systems to form a 100-year event is one of them. My God, thought Case, this is the perfect storm. As a result of this horrible alignment, the bulk of the Sword Fleet, way out by the Flemish Cap, is spared the brunt of the storm, while everyone closer to shore gets pummeled. The 105-foot Mr. Simon, 100 miles west of Albert Johnson, gets her aft door blown in. The wheelhouse flooded and her anchor fastenings torn off. The anchor starts slamming around on the deck, and a crewman has to go out and cut it free. The Lorry Dawn 8 loses her antennas and then takes a wave down her breather pipes that stuffs one of her engines. Farther south down the coast, the situation is even worse. a bulk carrier named the Eagle finds herself in serious trouble off the Carolinas, along with a freighter named the Star Baltic, and both struggle into port badly damaged. The 90-foot schooner Anne Christine, built 123 years ago, sinks off the coast of Delaware, and her crew has to be saved by the Coast Guard helicopters. The bulk carrier Zara, just 50 miles south of the Andrea Gale, takes 90-foot seas over her deck that shear off the steel bolts holding her portholes down. 30 tons of water flood the crew mess, continue into the officers' mess, explode a steel bulkhead, tear through 2 more walls, flood the crew's sleeping quarters, course down a companionway, and kill the ship's engine. The Zara is 550 feet long, and the sailing vessel Satori alone, at the mouth of the Great South Channel, is starting to lose the battle to stay afloat. Karen Stimson crouches miserably by the navigation table and listens to the Tuesday morning NOAA forecast. One of the worst storms since the blizzard of 78. Already 36 boats breached or sunk at Nauset Beach. Ship reports of 63-foot seas, which is probably high, but a sign of problems upcoming. Heavy surf advisory being issued despite temporary lull in the wind field. Instead of abating, as Leonard insisted, the storm just keeps getting worse. The seas are 30 feet and the winds are approaching a hurricane force. The boat rolls helplessly on her beam ends every time a wave catches her on the side. We were taking such a hammering, real neck-snapping violence, says Stimson. Things were flying. Every wave was knocking us across the cabin. It was only a matter of time before the boat started to break up. Bylander refuses to go on deck, and Leonard curls up on his bunk, sullen and silent, sneaking gulps of a whiskey bottle. Stimson puts on every piece of clothing she has, climbs the narrow companionway, and clips herself onto the lifeline. No matter what she does, lashing the tiller, running downwind, showing less jib, she cannot control the boat. Several times she's snapped to the end of her tether by boarding seas. Stimson knows that if she doesn't keep her bow to the weather, they'll roll, so she decides they have no choice but to run the engine. She goes below deck to ask Leonard how much fuel they have, but he gives a different answer each time she asks. That's a bad sign for both the fuel level and Leonard's state of mind. But fuel isn't their only problem. Leonard points out there's also the propeller itself. In such chaotic seas, the prop keeps lifting out of the water and revving too high. Eventually, the bearings will burn out. While Leonard is explaining the subtleties of prop cavitation, the first knockdown occurs. A wave catches the Satori broadsides and puts her mast in the water. The entire crew crashes against the far wall. Canned food rockets across the galley, and water starts pouring into the cabin. At first, Stimson thinks the hole has opened up, a death sentence, but the water has just burst through the main hatch. Debris and splintered glass litter the cabin, and the nav table is drenched. The single sideband is dead, and the VHF looks doubtful. Most of Stimson's experience is with wooden boats. In rough weather, they tend to spring their caulking and sink. Fiberglass is a lot stronger, but it, too, has its limits. Stimson just doesn't know what those limits are. There seems to be no way to keep the boat pointed into the seas, no way to minimize the beating they're taking. Even if the VHF can transmit Mayday, and it's impossible to know that for sure, it only has a range of several miles. They're 50 miles out at sea. Between waves, between slammings, Stimson shouts, "I think we should prepare a survival bag, in case we have to abandon ship." Bylander, grateful for something to do, sorts through the wreckage on the floor and stuffs tins of food, bottled water, clothes, and a wire cheese slicer into a sea bag. "Sue, we don't need the slicer. We can bite the cheese," Stimson says. But Bylander just shakes her head. "I've read about this, and it's the little niceties that make the difference. Ray, where are the boat cushions?" While preparing their emergency bag, they get knocked over a second time. This one is even more violent than the first, and the boat is a long time in coming back up. Stimson and Leonard pick themselves off the floor, bruised and dazed, and Bylander sticks her head out the hatch to check for damage on deck. "My God, Karen," she screams, "the life raft's gone." "I was in a corner, and I covered myself with soft things," says Stimson, "and with a flashlight, I took about 10 minutes and wrote some goodbyes and stuck it in a Ziploc bag and put it in my clothing." That was the lowest point. We had no contact with anyone. It was the dark of the night, which brings its own kind of terror, and I had a sense that things were going to get worse. But it's a strange thing. There was no sentiment there, no time for fear. To me, fear is 2 a.m. walking down a city street and someone's following me. That to me is terror beyond words. What was happening was not a terror beyond words. It was a grim sense of reality, scrambling to figure out what to do next, a determination to stay alive and keep other people alive, and an awareness of the dark, noisy slamming of the boat. But it wasn't terror beyond words. I just had an overwhelming sense of knowing we weren't going to make it. Simpson doesn't know it, but Bylander tapes her passport to her stomach so her body can be identified. Both women at this point are prepared to die. After Simpson finishes writing her goodbyes, she tells Leonard that it's time to issue a mayday. Mayday comes from the French word "Vens m'aides," come help me, and essentially means that those on board have given up all hope. It's up to someone else to save them. Leonard motionless on his berth. Okay, he says. Stimson forces her way out to the cockpit, and Bylander sits down at the nav table to see if she can coax the VHF back to life. At 11:15 p.m. on October 29th, a freighter off Long Island picks up a woman's terrified voice in the VHF. This is the Satori, 3949 north and 6952 west. We are 3 people. This is a mayday. If anyone can hear us, please pass our position on to the Coast Guard. Repeat, this is a mayday. If anyone can hear us, pass our position on to the Coast Guard. The freighter, the Gold Bond conveyor, relays the message to the Coast Guard operations in Boston, which in turn contacts the Coast Guard cutter Tamaroa in Provincetown Harbor. The Tamaroa has just come off Georgia's Bank, where she was conducting spot checks on the fishing fleet, and now she's waiting out the weather inside Cape Cod's huge flexed arm. A small Falcon jet scrambles from Air Station Cape Cod, and the Tamaroa, 1,600 tons and 205 feet, weighs anchor at midnight and heads down the throat of the storm. The crew of the Satori have no way of knowing whether the radio is working. They just have to keep repeating the mayday and hope for the best. And even if the radio is working, they still have to be within 2 or 3 miles of another vessel for the signal to be heard. That's a lot to ask for on a night like this. Bylander, wedged behind the nav table, broadcasts their name and positions intermittently for half an hour without any response at all. They're alone out there, as far as she can tell. She keeps trying. What else is there to do? And Stimson goes back on deck to try and keep the Satori pointed into the seas. She's not there long when she hears the sound of an airplane fading in and out through the roar of the storm. She looks around frantically in the darkness, and a minute later, a Falcon jet flying low under the cloud cover shrieks overhead and raises Bylander on the VHF. Sue was so excited. She was giddy, Stimson says. But I wasn't. I remember not feeling elated or relieved so much as, instantly, I rejoined the world of the living. The Falcon pilot circles just below cloud level and discusses what to do next over the VHF. With Bylander, the Tamaroa won't be there for another 12 hours, and they've got to keep the boat afloat until then, even if that means burning out the engine. They can't afford to risk any more knockdowns. Bylander's, against Leonard's wishes, finally toggles the starter switch, and to her amazement, it turns over. With the storm jib up and the prop turning away, they can now get a few degrees to the weather. It's not a lot, but it's enough to keep from getting broached by the seas. Throughout the night, the Falcon pilot flies over them, reassuring Bylander that they're going to come out of this alive. Stimson stays at the helm, and Leonard lies on his bunk, contemplating the impending loss of his boat. When the Tamaroa arrives, he'll have to abandon ship, which is an almost unthinkable act for a captain. The Satori is his home, his life, and if he allows himself to be taken off by the Coast Guard, he'll probably never see her again. Not intact anyway. At some point that night, lying on his bunk, waiting for dawn, Ray Leonard decides he won't get off the boat. The women can leave if they want to, but he'll see the vessel into port. Throughout that night, the Tamaroa slugs her way through the storm. She's a bulldog of a vessel, built to salvage crippled battleships in World War II, and she can tow anything afloat. According to her literature, the sea state is so high, though, that the most she can make is 3 or 4 knots, roughly walking pace. On the larger swells, she plunges into the crest, stalls, and launches out the far side, spray streaming off her bridge, and green water sheeting out her scuppers. She crosses Cape Cod Bay, threads the canal, leaves the Elizabeth Islands to starboard, and finally turns the corner around Martha's Vineyard. Commander Lawrence Brudnicki, chief officer on board, estimates that they'll arrive on scene late the next afternoon. The Satori crew has to stay afloat until then. They have no life raft or survival suits on board, and the nearest helicopter base is an hour away. If the Satori goes down, the crew is dead. Brudnicki can't speak directly to the Satori, but he can relay messages via the Falcon that's circling above them. Both ship and plane are also in contact with the 1st District Command Center in Boston. D1 Command Comsen, as it's referred to in Coast Guard reports. D1 Comsen is responsible for coordinating all the Coast Guard vessels and aircraft on the rescue, and developing the safest strategy for taking people off the boat. Every decision has to be approved by them. Since the Satori isn't sinking yet, they decide to have the Falcon fly cover until the Tamaroa arrives, and then take the crew off by raft. Air rescue in such conditions can be riskier than actually staying with the boat, so it's used as a last resort. As soon as day breaks, the Falcon will be relieved by an H-3 rescue helicopter, and H-3s will fly cover in shifts until the Tamaroa shows up. Helicopters have limited amount of flying time, but generally about 4 hours, but they can pluck people out of the water if need be. Falcon jets can't do much for people in the water, except circle them and watch them drown. From the incident log, D1 Comsen, 2:30 a.m., SV, sailing vessel, is running out of fuel. Recommend we try to keep Falcon OS on scene until Tamaroa arrives. 5:29 a.m., Falcon has lost comms. Communication with vessel. Vessel is low on battery power and taking on water. Pumps are keeping up, but are run by electric. 7:07 a.m., Falcon OS vessel has been located. 6 hours fuel left. People on board are scared. The H-3 arrives on scene around 6:30 and spends half an hour just trying to locate the Satori. The conditions are so bad that she's vanished from the Falcon's radar, and the H-3 pilot is almost on top of her before spotting her in the foam-streaked seas. The Falcon circles off to the southwest to prepare a life raft drop, while the H-3 takes up a hover directly over the boat. In these situations, the Falcon pilot could never line up on something as small as a sailboat, so the H-3 acts as a stand-in. The Falcon comes back at 140 knots, radar locked onto the helicopter, and the last moment the H-3 falls away and the jet makes the drop. The pilot comes screaming over the Satori's mast, and the co-pilot pushes 2 life raft packages out a hatch in the floorboards. The rafts are linked by a long nylon tether, and as they fall, they cartwheel apart, splashing down well to either side of the Satori. The tether, released at 200 feet into a hurricane-force wind, drops right into Bylander's hands. The H-3 hovers overhead, while the Satori haul in the packages, but both rafts have exploded on impact. There's nothing at either end of the line. The Tamaroa is still 5 hours away, and the storm has retrograded to within a couple of 100 miles of the coast. Over the next 24 hours, it will pass directly over the Satori. A daylight rescue in these conditions is difficult, and a nighttime rescue is out of the question. If the Satori crew is not taken off in the next few hours, there's a good chance they won't be taken off at all. Late that morning, the second H-3 arrives, and the pilot, Lieutenant Clausen, explains the situation to Ray Leonard. Leonard radios back that he's not leaving the boat. It's unclear whether Leonard is serious or just trying to save face. Either way, the Coast Guard is having none of it. 2 helicopters, 2 Falcon jets, and a medium-range cutter and 100 air and seamen have already been committed to the rescue. The Satori crew are coming off now. Owner refuses to leave and says he sailed through the hurricanes before. The Comsen incident log records at 12:24 that afternoon. The Tamaroa wants manifestly unsafe voyage so that owner-operator can be forced off. A manifestly unsafe voyage means that the vessel has been damaged, an unacceptable risk to her crew or others, and the Coast Guard has the legal authority to order everyone off. Commander Brudnicki gets on the radio with District 1 and requests a manifestly unsafe designation for the Satori, and at 12:47 it is granted. The Tamaroa is just a couple of miles away now, within VHF range of the Satori, and Brudnicki raises Leonard on the radio and tells him he has no choice in the matter. Everyone is leaving the boat. At 12:57 in the afternoon, 13 hours after weighing anchor, the Tamaroa plunges into view. There's a lot of hardware circling the Satori. There's the Falcon, the H-3, the Tamaroa, and the freighter Gold Bond conveyor, which has been cutting circles around the Satori since the first Mayday call. Hardware is not the problem, though. It's time. Dark is only 3 hours away, and the departing H-3 pilot doesn't think the Satori will survive another night. She'll run out of fuel, start getting knocked down, and eventually break apart. The crew will be cast into the sea, and the helicopter pilot will refuse to drop his rescue swimmer because he can't be sure of getting him back. It would be up to the Tamaroa to maneuver alongside the swimmers and pull them on board, and in the seas, it would be almost impossible. It's now or never. The only way to take them off, Brudnicki decides, is to shuttle them back to the Tamaroa in one of the little Avons. The Avons are 21-foot inflatable rafts with rigid hulls and outboard engines. One of them could make a run to the Satori, drop off survival suits, and then come back to pick up the crew. If anyone wound up in the water, at least they'd be insulated and afloat. It's not a particularly complicated maneuver, but no one has done it in conditions like this before. No one has even seen conditions like this before. At 1:23 p.m., the Tamaroa gathers at Port Davits. 3 men climb aboard the Avon, and they lower away. It goes badly from the start. What passes for a lull between waves is, in fact, crest to trough change of 30 or 40 feet. Chief Bosun Thomas Amadon lowers the Avon halfway down, gets lifted up by the next wave, can't keep up with the trough, and free falls to the bottom of the cable. The lifting eye gets ripped out of its mount, and Amadon almost pitches overboard. He struggles back into position, finishes lowering the boat, and makes way for the Tamaroa. The seas are twice the size of the Avon raft. With excruciating slowness, it fights its way to the Satori, comes up bow to stern, and a crew member flings the 3 survival suits on deck. Stimson grabs them and hands them out, but Amadon doesn't back out in time. The sailboat rides up a sea, comes down on the Avon, and punctures one of her air bladders. Things start to happen very fast now. The Avon's bow collapses. A wave swamps her to the gunwales. The engine dies, and she falls away astern. Amadon tries desperately to get the engine going again, and finally manages to, but they're up to their waists in water, and the raft is crippled. There's no way they can even get themselves back onto the Tamaroa, much less save the crew of the Satori. 6 people, not just 3 now, need to be rescued. The H-3 crew watches all this incredulously. They're in a 2 o'clock hover with their jump door open, just over the tops of the waves. They can see the raft dragging heavily through the seas, and the Tamaroa heaving through 90-degree rolls. Pilot Claude Hessel finally gets on the radio and tells Brudnicki and Amadon that he may have another way of doing this. He can't hoist the Satori crew directly off their deck, he says, because the mast is flailing too wildly and might entangle the hoist. That would drag the H-3 right down on top of the boat, but he could drop his rescue swimmer, who could take the people off the boat one at a time and bring them up on the hoist. It's the best chance they've got, and Brudnicki knows it. He consults with District 1 and then gives the okay. The rescue swimmer on Hessel's helicopter, Dave Moore, a 3-year veteran who has never been on a major rescue. The good cases don't come along too often. Usually someone beats you to them, he says. If a sailboat gets in trouble, far out, we usually get a rescue, but otherwise it's just a lot of little stuff. Moore is handsome in a baby-faced sort of way, square-jawed, blue-eyed, and a big open smile. He has a dense, compact body that is more seal-like than athletic. His profession of rescue swimmer came about when a tanker went down off New York in the mid-1980s. A Coast Guard helicopter was hovering overhead, but it was winter, and the tanker crew were too hypothermic to get into the lift basket. They all drowned. Congress decided they wanted something done, and the Coast Guard adopted the Navy Rescue Program. Moore is 25 years old, born the year Karen Stimson graduated from high school. Moore is already wearing a neoprene wetsuit. He puts on socks and hood, straps on swim fins, pulls a mask and a snorkel down over his head, and then struggles into his neoprene gloves. He buckles on a life vest and then signals to flight engineer Vriesman that he's ready. Vriesman, who has one arm extended, gate-like, across the jump door, steps aside and allows Moore to crouch by the edge. That means they're at 10 and 10, a 10-foot hover at 10 knots. Moore, who's no longer plugged into the intercom, signals final corrections to Vriesman with his hands, who relays them to the pilot. This is it. Moore has trained 3 years for this moment. An hour ago, he was in the lunch line back on base. Now he's about to drop into the maelstrom. Hessel holds a low hover with the boat at his 2 o'clock. Moore can see the crew clustered together on deck, and the Satori is making slow, plunging headway into the seas. Vriesman is settled next to Moore at the hoist controls, and avionics man Ayers is behind the co-pilot with the radio and search gear. Both wear flight suits and crash helmets, and are plugged into the internal communication system in the wall. The time is 2:07 p.m. Moore picks a spot between waves, takes a deep breath, and jumps. It's a 10-foot fall, and he hits feet first, hands at his side. He comes up, clears his snorkel, settles the mask, and then strikes out for the Satori. The water is lukewarm. They're in the Gulf Stream, and the seas are so big they give him the impression that he's swimming uphill and downhill rather than over individual waves. Occasionally, the wind blows a crest off, and he has to dive under the cascade of white water before setting out again. The Satori appears and disappears behind the swells, and the H-3 thunders overhead, rotors blasting a lily pad of flattened water into the sea. Vriesman watches anxiously, though through binoculars from the jump door, trying to gauge the difficulty of getting Moore back into the helicopter. Ultimately, as flight engineer, it's his decision to deploy the swimmer, his job to get everyone safely back into the aircraft. If he has any doubts, Moore doesn't jump. Moore swims hard for several minutes and finally looks up at Vriesman, shaking his head. The boat's under power, and there's no way he's going to catch her. Not in these seas. Vriesman sends the basket down, and Moore climbs back in. Just as he's about to ride up, the wave hits. It's huge and cresting 50 or 60 feet. It avalanches over Moore and buries both him and the life basket. Vriesman counts to 10 before Moore finally pops up through the foam, still inside the basket. It's no longer attached to the hoist cable, though. It's been wrenched off the hook, and it's just floating free. Moore has such tunnel vision that he doesn't realize the basket has come off. He just sits there, waiting to be hoisted. Finally, he understands that he's not going anywhere, and swims the basket over to the cable and clips it on. He climbs inside, and Vriesman hauls him up. This time, they're going to do things differently. Hessel banks the helicopter to within 50 feet of the Satori and shows a chalkboard that says Channel 16. Bylander disappears below, and when Hessel has her on the VHF, he tells her they're going to do an in-the-water pickup. They've got to get into the survival suits, tie the tiller down, and then jump off the boat. Once they're in the water, they are to stay in a group and wait for Moore to swim over to them. He'll pull them into the hoist basket and send them up one at a time. Bylander climbs back up on deck and gives the instructions to the rest of the crew. Moore, looking through a pair of binoculars, watches them pull on their suits and try to will themselves over the gunwale. First, one of them puts a leg over the rail, then another does, and finally all three of them splash into the water. It takes 4 or 5 minutes for them to work up the nerve. Leonard has a bag in one hand, and he goes over. As he goes over, he loses his grip and leaves it on deck. It's full of his personal belongings. He claws his way down the length of the hull and finally punches himself in the head when he realizes he's lost it for good. Moore takes this in, wondering if Leonard is going to be a problem in the water. Moore sheds his hood and gloves because the water's so warm and pulls his mask back down over his face. This is it. If they can't do it now, they can't do it at all. Hessel puts the Satori at his 6 o'clock by lining them up in a little rearview mirror and comes down into a lower hover. It's delicate flying. He finally gives Moore the go-ahead, and Moore breathes in deep and pushes off. They dropped Moore in, and he just skimmed over the top of the water flying towards us, says Stimson. When he gets there, he says, Hi, I'm Dave Moore, your rescue swimmer. How are you? And Sue says, Fine, how are you? It was very cordial, and then he asks who's going first, and Sue says, I will. And he grabbed her by the back of the survival suit and skimmed back across the water. Moore loads Bylander into the rescue basket, and 20 seconds later, she's in the helicopter. Jump to recovery takes 5 minutes. Avionics man Ayers is writing everything down in the hoist log. The next recovery, Simpson's takes 2 minutes, and Leonard takes 3. Leonard is so despondent that he's dead weight in the water. Moore has to wrestle him into the basket and push his legs in after him. Moore's the last one up, stepping back into the aircraft at 2:29. They've been on scene barely 2 hours. Moore starts stripping off his gear, and he's got his wetsuit halfway off when he realizes that the helicopter isn't going anywhere. It's hovering off the Tamaroa's port quarter. He puts his flight helmet on and hears the Tamaroa talking to Hessel, telling him to stand by because their Avon crew still needs to be recovered. Oh, Jesus, he thinks. Moore pulls his gear back on and takes up his position at the jump door. Hessel has decided on another in-the-water rescue, and Moore watches the 3 Coast Guardsmen grab hands and reluctantly abandon ship. Even from a distance, they look nervous. Hessel comes in low and puts them at his 6 o'clock again, barely able to find such small target in his rearview mirror. Moore gets the nod and jumps for the 3rd time. He's got the drill down now, and the entire rescue takes 10 minutes. Each Coast Guardsman that makes it into the aircraft gives Stimson a thumbs up. Moore comes up last via bare hook, and the report reads, and Vriesman pulls him in through the door. The H-3 Banks drops her nose and starts for home. When I got up into the helicopter, I remember everyone looking in my and Sue's faces to make sure we were okay, says Stimson. I remember the intensity. It really struck me. These guys were so pumped up, but they were also human. Real humanity. They'd take us by the shoulders and look us in the eyes and say, I'm so glad you're alive. We were with you. Last night, we prayed for you. We were worried about you. When you're on the rescuing side, you're very aware of life and death. And when you're on the rescued side, you just have a sort of numb awareness. At some point, I stopped seeing the risk clearly, and it just became an amalgam of experience and observation.